The Alpha King came to my door in the first week of the thaw, and I said no before he finished the question. I want that on the record, because everyone who tells this story afterward gets that part wrong. They tell it gently, as though I were being brave, or coy, or wounded. I was none of those things. I was making bread. I was 4 and 20 years old, a healer with no pack and no name anyone would say out loud, and I had spent one whole winter learning exactly how much cold a person can hold before her body starts bargaining. By the thaw, I had stopped bargaining. So when the most powerful wolf in the 7 valleys filled my doorway and opened his mouth, I already knew my answer. Because I had given it to the snow 100 times, and the snow had not argued. Let me tell you how I came to be there, in a hut past the boundary stone, where the pack puts the things it has decided not to keep. They cast me out in the dead of last winter. The charge was that a man had died under my hands, and I had let him. That part was true in the way the worst lies are true. He had died under my hands. I had not let him. There is a difference, and a difference is a thing a frightened pack cannot afford, so they walked me past the boundary cairn at first dark, with the snow coming sideways, and the Greymark Alpha, Roderick, told me that the pack's mercy was that they were not killing me themselves. I told him the winter would do it for them and save him the trouble. He did not like that. It remains one of my better exits. I did not die. I want to be clear that this was not destiny. It was a sound roof I patched, a snare line I set, and a stubbornness my mother left me in place of money. By the first thaw I had a hut, a garden coming up green through the rot of the snow, and the particular piece of a woman no one is coming for. Then someone came for me. I heard the escort before I saw it, too many feet for the high pass, the jangle of a king's travelling guard, the hush that falls on men when their lord stops walking. I did not go out. I am not a fool. I kept my hands in the dough and my eyes on the door, and the door darkened, and the cold spring light went out of my one window, and a voice I had only ever heard described said, "You are the healer they call the Greymark Exile." He did not cross the threshold. I noticed that before I noticed anything else about him, and I have noticed a great many things about Halva since, but that was the first. A king who could have had my door off its hinges with a word stood in the melt outside it and waited at the line, as though the line were his to respect. As though I still had a threshold that meant anything. I'm the healer they call gone. Whatever they call the rest of me, they can keep. I have come a long way to find you. Then you've wasted a long way. I shaped the loaf. I did not look up, which cost me, because not looking at a thing that large and that's still in your doorway takes a kind of muscle. I know what a king at a peasant's door means. It means he wants something only the peasant has. I had something like that once. It is the reason I make bread alone past a boundary stone. So whatever it is, no. There was a silence with weight in it. You haven't heard the question, he said. I've heard the shape of it. Now I looked. I will not pretend I was unmoved by the look of him. That would make me a liar. And the whole point of me is that I am not one. So I will tell you what I noticed instead of how my pulse behaved, because that is the truer thing. I noticed that he was dressed for war and carrying nothing. I noticed a younger pup peering from behind the guards, all enormous eyes and a too-thin face, who should not have been on a king's hard road. I noticed that the king of the 7 valleys, the wolf the songs are about, looked at a woman covered in flour as though she were the first warm thing he had seen in a year. The answer is going to be no in every shape. Save us both the daylight. He inclined his head, which I did not expect. Then he made camp in my valley, which I expected even less. This is the part the songs get wrong too. They make it grand. It was a king and his guard pitching tents a respectful distance down the slope from a one-room hut, a healer pretending through her window she could not see them, and a thaw coming on so the whole world dripped and ran and smelled of waking earth. He did not knock again that day. He sent a gift. The gift was a side of cured venison, which was sensible, a bolt of court blue wool, which was not. What does a woman past the boundary stone do with court blue wool? And a letter in a hand so careful it must have been copied twice, formally requesting the honour of my conversation at a time of my choosing, with 3 proposed times and an alternative if none suited. I sent the venison back. A person does not take meat from a man she intends to keep refusing. It muddies the books. I kept the wool, because I am not a saint and the nights were still cold. The letter I read 4 times, and then I stood in my doorway and called down the slope, "Your spelling is better than your judgment, your grace," and went back inside and did not come out, and felt, for the first time in a year, something move in my chest that was not the cold rearranging itself. He was, I would learn, courting me. He was doing it the way a man lays a siege, supply lines, staged advances, a written timetable. It was the single most ridiculous thing I have ever been subjected to, and I have been subjected to a winter alone. It would be a long time before I understood that a man courts you with a campaign, when a campaign is the only language he has ever been allowed to grieve in. The pup came across the threshold on the 3rd day, because pups do not read boundary stones. I came back from the snare line, and he was simply inside, curled in the warm by my banked fire, a scrap of a thing, 4 years old at most. Watching me with Halvar's own grey eyes, set in a smaller, hungrier face. When I crouched, he did not flinch the way I expected a pup to flinch from a stranger. He crawled into my lap as though he had been looking for it, pressed his cold nose to my wrist where the pulse is, and sighed the enormous sigh of a creature that has found, against all sense, a place to put down its weight. "You are not supposed to be in here," I told him. "Nobody is," he agreed, with devastating 4-year-old logic, and fell asleep. His name was Pell. He had stowed away on a King's War road because the alternative was a hall full of people who handled him carefully and loved him from a distance. I did not know yet what he reminded them of. I only knew that he ate like the starving and slept like the safe, and that within a week he called my hut home and called me nothing at all, because the name he wanted to use was one he had been told not to want. I let him stay. That was my second mistake. If no is a thing you can be wrong about. A woman can hold a line against a king. Nobody holds a line against a small boy who has decided you are his. It was the pup who got the king across my threshold in the end, and not on purpose, and not the way you'd think. Pell took a fever on the 9th day, the hard kind that comes up the spine, and I did what I am, I worked. And somewhere in the long bad night of it, fever frantic, the boy started crying for someone. And the someone was at the bottom of the slope, and I had a choice between my principles and a child who could not breathe. And I have never in my life chosen principles over a child who could not breathe. So I opened my door, and I crossed my own threshold for the first time since the thaw, and I went down the dark slope to a king's tent, and said the only word I had sworn never to say to him. Help. He came up the hill at a dead run. He came into my hut without being asked, the first man to do it, and I found I did not mind, which unsettled me more than the fever did, and he went down on his knees beside the pallet and took that small burning hand in both of his and said, "Pell, Pell, I'm here," in a voice stripped of every kingly thing, and the boy quieted at the sound of it the way only blood quiets to blood. I saw the king of the 7 valleys hold a sick child the way you hold the last of something, and I saw the boy's grey eyes, and the king's grey eyes, and the shape of a grief that had been standing at a respectful distance for a year, and I understood that I had been refusing the wrong question the entire time. The fever broke toward dawn, and Pell slept clean. I spoke first, over the boy's head. "He's not yours. He's too like you to be yours. A man's son favours his mother enough to bear it. This one is a copy of a copy." Halvar did not look up from the boy's face. "He is my brother's son. Leif's." His thumb moved once across the small knuckles. "Leif is dead. I'm sorry." "You should not be." He looked at me then, and there was no campaign in it, no timetable, no careful copied hand. He died last winter in the Greymark Hall of a wound that went bad, and the healer who could not save him was driven out across the boundary stone into the snow to die for it. The fire popped. I have spent a year, healer, telling myself I came over the pass for the truth of how my brother died. I am a poor enough liar that it took a 4-year-old crossing your threshold to show me I came, because my wolf has not been able to settle since the night I heard there was a woman alive at the top of the world who had held my brother's life in her hands. I do not know yet whether to thank you or hang you. That is the question you have been refusing. Now you have heard it. So, there it is. The man I had been turning from my door was the brother of the man I was exiled for failing to save, and he had crossed the 7 valleys not knowing if he was coming to a saviour or a murderer, and his dead brother's child was asleep in my lap with my fingerprints all over his fever. I should have been afraid. I have told you about fear and stubbornness sharing a room in me. The stubbornness stood up first, then I'll tell you how your brother died, and you can decide which rope to reach for. Lief came to me with a sword cut 3 days old and already turning. 3 days, Your Grace. A clean wound becomes a killing one in 3 days only if someone keeps it from being cleaned. I opened it, I drew the rot, I sat with him 2 nights. On the 3rd, someone brought him wine I did not pour, and by morning the fever had a friend in his blood it should not have had, and he was gone before midday, and by dark I was the one walking into the snow. I held his eyes the way I had held Roderick's. I did not kill your brother. I was the only person in that hall trying to keep him. I know, Halvar said. Of all the things I had braced for, I had not braced for that. I have read the Greymark accounting 4 times, he went on, and now the careful hand made sense. Now the whole copied twice precision of the man made sense. He was a creature who reread things until they confessed. It does not add. A healer blamed and exiled inside a single night, before any moot, before any witness was called. Packs do not move that fast unless someone needs a door shut before anyone thinks to look behind it. He rose. He was very tall in my small room, and he made it smaller, and yet I did not feel the walls come in. I felt, absurdly, that the roof I had patched alone was holding up more than it was built for and doing fine. I did not come for the truth, whatever I told my counsel, but I seemed to have found some anyway, and I find I am no longer asking whether to hang you, healer. I am asking who poured the wine. Ask your counsel. You brought it up the mountain with you. His jaw did the thing I would come to know, the small, still tightening of a man hearing the unwelcome obvious, because he had not come alone, of course. A king does not. He had brought his guard, and his physicians, and his second, the man who managed his correspondence, and his calendar and, it would turn out, a great deal else. The man who had so helpfully known which path to take to find the Greymark exile. The man named Osric, who was at that moment asleep in a warm tent at the bottom of my hill, having steered his grieving king across 7 valleys to the one witness who could unmake him. But I am ahead of myself. We did not know that yet. We only knew the books did not add, and that a child was sleeping between us, and that the sun was coming up green and wet over a world that smelled like beginning, and that I had let the king of the 7 valleys across my threshold, and had not. When it came to it, wanted to put him back out. Don't. I had seen the shape of the thought arrive on his face, the one that wanted to be gratitude, or worse, hope. I have not said anything. You were about to thank me. Or apologize. Your face was choosing. I stood and put the kettle on, because a woman needs her hands occupied around a feeling that size. I don't want either one. I have been thanked by powerful men. It is what they give you, instead of the thing you actually kept them from taking. So no thanks, no sorrow, and no. I gestured at the wool, the letters, the careful siege of it all, no campaign. If you want to find who poured the wine, I'll help you, because your brother deserved better and so did I. But I am helping. I am not being rescued. There is a difference, and a difference is the only thing I have left that's mine. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, My wolf likes you better than my counsel. which was not an answer, and was somehow the only true thing anyone had said in my hut all winter, and I had to turn to the kettle so he would not see my face do what it wanted to. Let me catch my breath here, because the warm part of this story ends about now, and I would rather tell the cold part with a clear head. Before I do, would you have opened that door the first week of the thaw, or kept making your bread? Tell me, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every comment, all the way out here, past the edge of things. If hers is a voice you want more of, subscribe, and the next one will come find you. All right. Word travels even past a boundary stone. Within 3 days, the Greymark pack knew their king was camped on the Exiles' Hill, and within 4 they had a new story. And the new story was the obvious one, the witch. It is always the witch. A king does not pitch his tents below a cast-out woman's door for a fortnight, because the books do not add up. A king does that because she has bewitched him, has put the exile's eye on him, has reached up out of the snow she was rightly buried in, and hooked her claws in his good and grieving heart. Roderick himself came up the pass with it, and a moot at his back, and the bold nerve of a man who has decided that doubling a crime is safer than admitting it. "Step away from her, your grace," he called up the slope, loud, for the moot to hear. "She has worked on you. Look at you, sleeping in the cold under her window like a hound. The kindest thing now is to put the creature down and break the working, and the pack will swear it was mercy." I came out before Halva could answer, because it was my hill, and because I have a constitutional inability to let a man like Roderick have the last loud word. Mercy, the moot quieted to hear the witch speak. They always want to hear it, the way you want to look at a wound. You called it mercy in the snow, too, when you put me out to die without a moot. Funny, I keep being offered the pack's mercy, and it keeps looking exactly like the pack's convenience, wearing a clean shirt. I came down to the boundary cairn, the stone they'd walked me past a year before, and I put my hand flat on the cold top of it, where the whole moot could see, and I did not cross it. Because I would cross that line on my own day, or not at all. I worked no eye on your king. I set his nephew's fever. I told him the truth your books are too frightened to hold. If that is witchcraft, Roderick, then your hall has been starving for witches, because the gods know it has been short of healers and honest men both. It landed. I felt it land in the moot, the way you feel a current change. But Roderick had not climbed a mountain to be corrected by a woman he'd already buried once, and his hand went to where a hand goes, and the moot tensed, and for one bright, cold breath I thought I had finally, genuinely, talked my way to my death. And the king of the 7 valleys stepped down the slope and put himself between me and the moot, between an exile and her own pack, and said, in the voice the songs are actually about, the one that does not rise because it has never had to, "She is under my protection." The exile of this woman was unlawful. There was no moot, no witness, no accounting that holds. It is overturned, here, before all of you. Anyone who lays a claim on her life answers to me for it. You do not understand what that costs a king until you have watched a hall full of alphas realize their high king has just spent his unquestioned word to shield a cast-out healer with flower still in her hair. I watched it cost him. I watched the moot do the arithmetic, that the king had bound his own authority to a witch's fate, that if she fell, he fell with her. And I watched Roderick's face change from fury to something far more dangerous, which was calculation. And down at the bottom of the hill, outside the king's tent, I saw a quiet man in a steward's grey, watching all of it with his hands folded, taking the measure of exactly how much his king had just put within reach of one well-poured cup. I should have known him then. I had been so busy with the loud danger that I missed the still one. That is the oldest mistake there is, and I am a healer. I of all people should know that the wound that kills you is rarely the one making the noise. That night Pell slept between us by the fire, not because anyone arranged it, but because a 4-year-old arranges himself, and he had decided his 2 warm things would be on either side of him, and that was that. and Halvar, across the small sleeping shape of his brother's son, asked me the second real question of his life. Why did you truly refuse me at the door? Not the speech about rescue. The truth. I could have lied. The dark made it easy, and the boy made it safe. But I had built my whole self on being the one person in the 7 valleys who did not lie, and I was not going to spend that on a man who had just spent his crown on me. Because being wanted by the powerful is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me. Twice now. The first time, a pack wanted a healer until they wanted a scapegoat more. And the wanting turned in my hand like a knife. So when a king filled my door, I heard the wanting and I flinched from it before I could even see your face, because I have learned what it costs to be the thing a powerful man needs. It is not the same as being the thing he sees. I looked at him over the child. You came up this mountain needing a witness, or a savior, or a murderer. All of those are uses. I am tired down to my bones of being a use. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he had let it go. When I was a boy, he said finally, my father told me a king cannot afford to want things. He can only need them, because need can be defended to a council, and want cannot. I have run a kingdom on that for 30 years. His hand found the boy's hair in the dark. I told my council I needed the witness. I told myself I needed the truth. I am telling you, because you do not permit lies in this hut, and I find I have stopped wanting to tell them anyway, that somewhere on the 3rd valley I stopped needing anything, and started, for the first time since I was a boy, simply to want. I want to know you. Not for the wine, not for the witness, not for the song. I have no defensible reason, and I have come 7 valleys to give you the indefensible one. The fire was almost out. That is the difference you keep talking about. I finally see it. I am not here for the use of you. I am just here. I did not say anything. There are moments where saying anything would be a smaller thing than the silence, and I had spent a year learning the worth of silence. But I reached across the sleeping boy, in the last of the firelight, and I put my hand over the king's where it rested in his nephew's hair, and I left it there, which from me, that night, was the loudest thing I had ever said. It would have been a good place for the story to turn warm and stay there. The quiet man at the bottom of the hill had other plans. Osric made his move at the reckoning moot, the one Halvar called to put the truth of Leif's death before the assembled packs, and lift my name in front of the same valleys that had buried it. It should have been my vindication. It was very nearly all our graves. The king rose to speak in the great moot ground, the standing stones and the whole of the 7 valleys alphas ringed around, with me at his side, not behind him, at his side which the packs were still choking on, and Pell on my hip, because the boy would not be parted from me, and Halvar lifted the grey mark accounting to read aloud the gaps in it. The 3 days, the wine no one would own. And his second, his trusted Osric, stepped forward with a cup of his own and the smooth grief of a man who has rehearsed his lines, and said, Your Grace, before you shame these loyal packs on a witch's word, drink and steady yourself, for this is hard hearing, and held out the cup, and it was such a small gesture, such a servant's gesture, the steward easing his grieving lord, that not one alpha in that ring saw it for what it was. I did. I had spent 2 nights a year ago watching a wound turn from a poured cup. I knew the particular way a man holds a thing he is lying about. And I knew, in the half-second before the king's hand closed on it, with a certainty that went through me like the cold off the boundary stone, who had poured the wine for Leif. Because a man only learns that smooth, grieving, helpful pour in one school, and he practices it on the brother before he perfects it on the king. I did not have time for a speech. I have given you enough of my speeches. This is the one moment I had none. I knocked the cup from the king's hand with the boy still on my hip, and it spun away across the stones, and Osric, gentle, careful Osric, moved the way still men move when the stillness was only ever a held breath, and the blade that came out of his steward's grey was meant for the king's throat, and I was already between them, because that is where I had put myself, and it went into me instead. I will not dress it up. It went in below the ribs, and it was the worst thing I have ever felt, and I have felt a winter. I went down on the cold stone with Pell screaming, and my own blood startlingly warm on my hands, the same hands they had blamed, and somewhere very far above me the king of the 7 valleys made a sound I have never heard a man make before or since, and I felt it. That is the part I cannot explain to anyone who has not lived it. I felt his terror come down the length of a bond I had spent a year refusing, as though my refusing had never once fooled the thing itself. The guards had Osric before he reached the 2nd stone. But it was not the guards who undid him. It was the cup, spilled and steaming on the rock, and the alphas who bent to smell it and knew the scent. And a steward with a witness's blood on his blade and no grief left anywhere on his clever face. He had let the king's brother die to climb, and meant to let the king die to rule through a 4-year-old he could shape, and a living healer was the one thread that could pull the whole weave loose, so he had steered his grieving lord across 7 valleys to her door, certain he was delivering her to a noose, and instead he had delivered her to exactly the spot where she could see his hand on the cup. I know all this because they told me, after I missed the end of my own crowd-pleaser. I was busy bleeding. What I remember is Halvar on his knees on the moot stone, the king, kneeling, in front of every alpha in the 7 valleys. With no thought spared for what it cost, both his hands pressed to the wound to keep me in the world, saying my name like it was the only word that had survived some fire. Marin, Marin, stay, that is an order, that is a king's order, stay. And I remember that I laughed, which hurt enormously, and said, I don't take your orders. And that the laugh is probably what kept me awake long enough for my own hands to guide his to the right place, because I am a healer, and I was not going to die of a wound I knew how to dress, just because the dresser was crying too hard to see. I lived. I want to be clear, again, that this was not destiny. It was a steady hand on the bleeding, mine over his, and a stubbornness my mother left me, and a king who did exactly what I told him for once in his life. They tried Osric where the standing stones are, which is the only court a thing like that should have, and the 7 valleys heard the whole of it, the wine for the brother, the blade for the king, the exile arranged in a single night to bury a healer who knew how a clean wound turns. He had built his whole rise on the one bet that no one ever looks at the quiet, helpful man at the Lord's shoulder. He lost it in front of everyone. What they did with him after is not a thing for a warm story. It is enough to say the 7 valleys are short one clever steward and will not miss him. Roderick, who had not poured the wine, but had been so very eager to put the only witness in the snow, was stripped of the grey mark, and sent to live the rest of his days as exactly what he had made of me. A man passed a boundary stone, kept by no one. I am told he finds it less restful than he'd hoped. And the king asked me, a 3rd time, the question he had been failing to ask since the thaw. He did it properly, which from him I had learned to read as love. He waited until I could stand. He came to my hut, to the threshold, again, that man, and his thresholds. And this time he did not stop at the line. He crossed it, because I had left the door open, which we both understood was its own kind of answer, and he stood in my one small room that had held a whole winter of my refusing, and he did not bring a campaign. He brought nothing. He had finally learned. I am not going to offer you a use, he said, not a healer's place, not a luna's crown, not a witness's reward. Those are all things you would be to other people. I am asking if you will let me be a man who is simply, indefensibly yours, and who would like, with no counsel on earth able to justify it, to be allowed to be glad of you for the rest of a life you saved twice. His mouth did the thing it did. You may still say no. You have built your whole self on being able to. I would not take that from you for the world. I am only asking you to want to say something else. So I said something else. I will tell you only that the kiss was not careful, and that it was the first thing in 2 years I had reached for instead of braced against. That something in me that had been holding a line since a winter night at a boundary stone finally set the weight down and understood that being wanted was not the same as being used after all. Not when the wanting asked nothing and stayed anyway. Then I stopped keeping the record. That part is mine. It is a year on now, and the thaw has come around again, which I notice differently than I used to. I am Luna of the 7 Valleys, which still makes me laugh in the wrong moments, usually formal ones. The court has had to learn that their queen says exactly what she thinks and crosses every threshold on her own day, and they have decided. The way courts decide about weather, simply to live with it. Pell sleeps down the corridor now, in a room with a real bed he mostly ignores, because he still prefers to arrange his warm things around himself by a fire, and his warm things are us. He calls me the name now. The one he was told not to want. He tried it out small and sideways one morning over porridge. Watching my face for whether it was allowed, and I told him it was the only thing in this whole castle that had ever been his by right, and he has not stopped using it since, mostly at top volume. A letter came from the Grey Mark last month, the pack, not the man. A new young alpha asking, carefully, whether the Luna might ever consent to send a healer to a hall that finds itself short of them. And honest men both. I have not decided. I keep the letter on the mantel, unanswered. The way you keep a door you have not yet chosen to open or close. And some nights I catch Halvar looking at it, and looking at me, and saying nothing, because he learnt long ago that I will cross that line on my own day or not at all, and that the waiting is the whole of how he loves me. There is a threshold at the front of the great hall, worn smooth by 1,000 years of wolves crossing it as though it were nothing. I crossed it the first time as a cast-out healer with a king at her back and a child on her hip and a knife wound barely closed, and the whole court held its breath to see if the exile would falter at the line. I did not falter. I have been put out of one door in my life, in the snow, in the dark, and I learnt the only thing worth learning from it, which is this. A threshold is not a thing that is done to you. It is a thing you decide to cross. I said no to a king once. It is still the proudest yes I ever gave. So tell me, would you have opened the door that first cold week of the thaw, or would you have kept making your bread and let the most powerful wolf in the 7 Valleys waste his long road? Be honest. Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from while you're at it. I read everyone out here at the warm end of a very long winter. If you want to be there when the next one comes looking, subscribe and leave your door open just a crack. Moon and Iron, her side of it, all the way through.